Pentiment is like the first town you visit in a sprawling Western fantasy RPG. It's the small village on a forest's edge, a settlement with pastoral vibes and low-stakes issues. It's the place where you'll meet some peasants and some merchants and some craftsmen. And it's also the place from which you'll shortly depart to move on to bigger towns with bigger issues. Except in Pentiment, that last part never happens, and that's very intentional. The scope of this game is laser focused on this small town for all three of its acts, allowing you to learn about its people and its culture, its religions and its conflicts, all while investigating the murder mystery that pushes the narrative along. What is Pentiment? That's actually a really simple question to answer. Obsidian is positioning this as a narrative adventure game, and until we get a better genre label, I'd say that's a pretty good fit. It plays like the point and clicks of yore, just without the inventory and smushing items together and occasionally arcane puzzle solutions. Now I know what you're thinking. If you take those elements away from a point and click, doesn't that just leave you with a game about walking around and talking to people? And you'd be correct. Pentiment is completely unconcerned with the need to replace those genre staples. The closest thing to what you'd conventionally consider gameplay is the sort of time management aspect that comes by virtue of days passing as you investigate the murder. But even that feels like a stretch because no avenues feel truly wrong, and all will progress the story, albeit in different ways. If you're on the fence about Pentiment, I think the first question you need to answer for yourself is whether or not you're okay with playing what's effectively a walking simulator. I know there's been stuff like this floating around the indie scene for a while, but this is the first time I can recall a game so weirdly niche and boldly gameplayless coming from a studio like Obsidian. Even other recent dialogue-heavy non-combat games like Disco Elysium still gamify the act of speaking with dialogue checks and stat building in a way that Pentiment just does not. And I don't necessarily mean that as a dig, far from it. Pentiment knows what it is, and what it is will not be for everyone. Had this game been produced by this same studio even as little as 5 years ago, I can almost guarantee you there would be another gameplay system bolted on here to justify its existence as a video game. But I'm glad that changing sentiments, or actually the changing economics of how games are consumed, have opened up this door for Obsidian to create this title. Without the traditional gameplay to keep your hands busy, Pentiment's success is entirely hinged on its narrative, and that narrative is really good. You play as Andreas, a young artist in Renaissance-era Bavaria who works writing manuscripts in a small-town abbey, in between inking his personal masterpiece. It's an out-of-the-way town where not a lot really happens until there's been a murder. Duties to investigate this murder fall to you, and you can uncover details by talking to individuals in this town and sometimes doing favors for them. Structurally, the game has a time-based element. It's not a literal timer, you can spend as much time on a screen or a conversation as you want, it's just that certain key events will push time forward. You'll never get stuck because there's usually multiple triggers for getting the clock to move. It's not like you're going to spend your time walking around looking for a square hole to put the square peg into, as much as it is you'll eventually wander into something that will take more of your time from a narrative perspective. Then the clock will move. If the idea of time pressure intimidates you, don't be in this case. It's not oppressive in its implementation here, I promise. Days are broken down into dedicated working, eating, and sleeping blocks, and that eating one is the most important largely because of how flexible it is. Many people in town are going to be willing to have lunch with the local artist, and who you choose to break bread with in Pentiment is very important because you can't have 2 lunches or 2 dinners a day. Be careful about making dinner plans while the sun is still up, because who knows what might change by the time it sets. As you work through the murder and extract more information from the townsfolk, you'll gain a better understanding of this world and its people. Don't worry if you have no prior knowledge of Bavaria. I certainly didn't and could keep up. The game is very people-focused, and I'm sure someone who does have a personal interest in this era of history will glean more details out of it than I could, but it's by no means required. Conversations that bring up key historical figures or events will actually let you click a button to get them defined and contextualized. Something Obsidian did a ton for in their lore-based fantasy RPGs, now just apply to the lore of our human history. It's a great feature, and very helpfully it also visualizes faces of villagers that are being referenced. You'll very quickly develop a mental map of who these villagers are, where they typically go through during their routines, who they like, who they don't like, etc. It's worth noting that all this dialogue happens without voiceover. Now, for a game that's exclusively about talking to people, I was really skeptical about no VO. And while my sentiment hasn't totally changed after rolling credits, I think they did the next best thing. Dialogue presentation was clearly a tremendous focus area to try to offset the lack of VO, particularly fonts and how those fonts are propagated onto the screen. Different characters utilize different fonts to reflect their personality, their vocation, their class, and more. The monks and the abbot will have monastic letters. The peasants typically use some variation of a more free-form script, and the local printer will print his font into the dialog box. All of the above have different variations of how the ink will fill the letters and sound differently based on how the pen will scratch against the vellum. They really fill the void where VO would be. It might be the highest effort I've ever seen put into dialog boxes in any game, and my longing for voiceover mostly subsided after some time with this system. Of course, that high-effort presentation extends beyond the dialogue too. You've been looking at it for these past few minutes, and you can tell that it really has its own vibe. It's got this intentionally rigid style to make it look and feel like a painting of the era, and simultaneously it manages a ton of expressions in the faces and subtle movements. It's also got some really cool visual details where, much like the fonts, some characters are drawn in different art styles. Some of the elderly villagers who are still clinging onto the old ways of the town pre-Christianity are also holding onto art styles from before Christianity's influence too. It does some other cool tricks with its presentation that I won't spoil, but rest assured it's consistent and high quality throughout the whole game. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the narrative and the town in a very general non-spoiler sense, because they really are the linchpin that hold this game together. I mentioned before that you don't need to bring a ton of Bavarian history to the table, but you definitely should bring a sprinkle of Renaissance or religious history with you. Religion is profoundly important to the themes and the plot of Pentiment because it's profoundly important to the people of Pentiment, and the Protestant Reformation gets represented as a little microcosm within this village. The mere mention of Martin Luther can silence a room because he's not a historical footnote but a contemporary controversy. It was weirdly personal for me because of all the time I spent in Catholic schooling. I can't help but get these nostalgic pangs for the old abbeys and stained glass windows and Benedictine brothers walking around everywhere. I'm not saying that you needed to go to a preppy Catholic school to get maximum enjoyment out of this game, but what I am saying is that it hits different if you spent most of your post-recess time being forced to watch The Song of Bernadette and being discouraged by nuns from reading The Golden Compass. I'll try to stop myself from getting sidetracked, but the narrative is strong. It also makes the decision to have each of its 3 acts play out over the course of decades, allowing you to see the people grow and generations pass, as well as letting you see the long-term ramifications of your actions. If there's one issue I had with the narrative, it would be the kind of sluggish third act. It picks up at the very end. This game definitely delivers on its core murder mystery premise in a way that's rewarding and makes a ton of sense contextually with the game's themes, and is also suspiciously similar to Pillars of Eternity 1, but I'm betting they're hoping nobody notices because I think I'm the only one who read all the text in that game. But yeah, the bevy of choices found in Acts 1 and 2 aren't as present in Act 3. Without getting spoilery, you kind of see all the decisions you're going to make in Act 3 at the very beginning of that act, and you spend the rest of it just being railroaded into executing them. It's hard to explain, but it does feel much more formulaic and slow compared to the other two, and it's my largest inhibitor to giving this game the immediate repeat playthrough that I will undoubtedly do one day. But don't let that discourage you. The fact that a slow section is the anomalous contrast and not the norm for a game about walking around and talking to people just speaks volumes to how good that talking to people is. They did it. They executed on this narrative adventure with such a high level of production and intrigue and unique setting choice. They sold me on this type of game, and I hope it's not the last time we see something like this from Obsidian. It was a great way to explore this time and place, and while the intentionally light serving of gameplay will turn some people off, I think it has the same opportunity to appeal to people games normally wouldn't. Pentiment could be a required play for a student of European history. It could be a recommendation to your history-loving uncle who doesn't play games. Or it could just be your weekend fling if you're a core gamer. I'm really excited about how Pentiment turned out, and I'm just as excited about the prospect of playing all the games it will inevitably inspire.